Hello, Williamson County Genealogical Society members. My name is Debbie Tipping, and for March's meeting, I was going to present immigration, naturalization, and related records. Given the cancellations with the COVID-19 virus, we decided to try to do this via the web. So please feel free to give us some feedback on this type of presentation when we cannot meet together. As I said, my name is Debbie Tipping. The PLCGS after my name stands for Professional Learning Certificate in Genealogical Studies. I earned the American Record Certificate from the National Institute of Genealogical Studies. My grand plan is to become a certified genealogist so that I can work with military repatriation projects. That is when service members' remains are found and returned to the military. Genealogists are hired to identify living descendants of these potentially military personnel in order to obtain DNA samples from them that are processed through the Department of Defense in order to identify them so that they can be buried in the appropriate places. So tonight, for immigration, naturalization, and related records, we really are trying to figure out what countries did my ancestors come from. In my case, I know that all of my ancestors came from Europe, and most of them that I've identified so far have come from Northern Europe. But there are several where I just am not certain where they came from. So the documents groups that we're going to look at today should help you hopefully tease out where some of your ancestors came from. So immigration and naturalization records began quite early in what was to become the United States of America. As early as 1565, there were settlers from Spain in St. Augustine, Florida. And the settlers that took ships over to Florida, their manifests are in Spain. History has told us about Jamestown. In 1607, Jamestown was founded. Those records are in England of the people that came over, but because of the interest in Jamestown in the United States, there are also many records and many documented families from that area. In 1795, the US government, the Congress, decided to pass rules for obtaining citizenship. They first required 5 years of residency before you could apply for citizenship. An immigrant was required to file a declaration of intention to become a citizen after they had been in the United States for at least 2 years, and then 3 years they would file the actual petition to become a citizen. Now, for whatever reason, in 1798, Congress decided that needed to be changed to 14 years of living in the United States instead of 5, but then in 1802 it went back to 5 years. In 1820, the Congress again passed a law that required all passenger lists to be kept at the port of entry. And so if you have ancestors that came to the United States after 1820, there is a high degree of probability you will find them on a passenger list if they landed in the United States. So looking at passenger lists, there's one important thing you need to know. They were created at the port of departure. That means they were created before they left. This is where a lot of the name changes that happened to immigrants occurred. It was on the passenger list because when a ship arrived at one of the ports in the United States, one of the ship's crew took the passenger list to the port authority, and then the passengers came off the ship and checked in. So there were some major ports of departure, one in France, one in Germany, and one in England. So imagine someone coming from a country into the port at France, and there being a dialogue problem. The two could not understand each other well, and maybe they couldn't explain how to spell their name. It could be written in a different way, and unfortunately it stuck. Again, they were not required until 1820. There are passenger lists or passenger manifests that exist before 1820, but they're going to be more hit or miss. And you need to be very careful of the online search boxes, because what you are searching when you type a name into that online search box is you are searching a transcribed list. That means someone looked at the ship's manifest and guessed how their names were spelled. Sometimes they guess well, sometimes they don't. So if you type a name into the online search box and you don't find your ancestor, that doesn't mean that they're not on the list. That may mean you're going to have to do some more digging to find the ship, to find the exact date, and actually look at these passenger lists page by page. Another important thing to remember is don't forget to check books. I know we all love the internet, but for a very long time, people have been transcribing passenger lists and other documents that genealogists use and writing books. And these books are available at libraries. For specifically passenger lists, you might want to look for different groups like Germans to America or Belgians to America. Look for titles like that, and you can also search for passenger lists to see if you get any hits for titles. And remember, we have interlibrary loan. So you can go to your closest library and ask them to request the book. Border crossings were another way people came into the United States. Canada is part of the United Kingdom, so it is not uncommon for people to sail from England to Canada, maybe live in Canada for a year or two, and then move down into the United States. Or maybe they just sailed straight to Canada and went straight to the United States. The same thing with Mexico. People came from Spain to Mexico and then came up into the United States. As you can see on this slide, it was quite late before they started requiring records be kept. So records of Canadian crossings were not required until 1895, and depending upon which port of entry for the Mexican records, they were not required until 1903, and maybe later, depending upon where they came through. The pictures on this slide are of a border crossing from Mexico into El Paso. I found this on FamilySearch.org. What I wanted to show you is that this particular card from the border crossing in April of 1946 contained only a fingerprint, but a few years later, instead of a fingerprint in that spot, there were photos. Passport applications may also give us a hint of where our ancestors came from. It's important to know that before 1856, multiple agencies issued passports. It could be the state, it could be the county, it could be the federal government. There were lots of different agencies. It was after 1856 that only the Department of State issued passports, just like we get our passports from the Department of State today. And it's important to note that passports were not required until 1941 universally. There was a short period of time during the Civil War where passports were required, but then the requirement dropped again after the Civil War. Unfortunately, passport applications have not been digitized. If you want to search for an ancestor to see if they did file for or request a passport, you're going to have to communicate with either the National Archives and Records Administration or the Department of State. Between 1795 and 1925, the National Archives has those microfilms. Our closest National Archive regional center is in Fort Worth. Before you drive up there to see if you can see your ancestor's passport application on microfilm, please make sure you contact them, either call them or email them to make sure they actually have those microfilms. Outside of Washington, D.C., there are regional NARA repositories, and they only hold regional records except for a few exceptions, like they'll hold all of the United States censuses on microfilm for every state, but they may only hold the military records or some other form of early records for their particular region. You can also determine where your ancestors came from through foreign departures and emigration records. Maybe at the particular port, they actually kept a list of people who left, not just the ship manifest or the passenger list that went to the new location. And the trick with these is they're only useful if you know where your ancestor left from. Another type of foreign departure or emigration record is called a city register. And I will show you the city register for one of my immigrant families. So here is the full 2 pages from a pre-printed book from Binnenperlu in the Netherlands. And I'm showing you the whole page so that you can see at this particular house address, families moved in, families left, families moved in, and families left. My family is the first 8 lines. Here's a close-up of the far left. Here is my Goldbach family, and here is the head of household, Hermanus Antonis, and underneath is his wife, Geertjen, but she is listed as Brugink, which is her maiden name. One of the nice things about the Dutch people is women kept their maiden names even after they were married. So I already know who her maiden name is without much effort. Also, the neat thing about this record is here in column 7. It says to record the year that they were born. Well, this city clerk recorded the full birth date. So I have the full birth dates of this immigrant family. I also have the relation to the head of household. Here it says head of household, wife, daughter, son, daughter, ditto. This basically implies that she was a servant, and this is the son. The far left of that 2 pages says here in column 16, what year did they leave this particular city? And in column 17, where did they go? So you can see it says August 1865 for when they left and they went to America. Down here is the girl that was the servant. And here, unfortunately, this child died 2 years before the family left. How do I know that? That's what overlijden means, the year that they died. And again, the city clerk wrote the full date, not just the year. Other ways to tease out where your ancestors came from would be ethnic sources. Those include ethnic societies. There is a Danish men's society that still exists in the community where my second great-grandfather and grandmother emigrated to in Wisconsin. And at least one of my great uncles was a member there. This society began back when they came over in the mid-1800s. And ethnic societies are going to have papers. They're not going to be microfilmed, they're not going to be digitized, but you may be able to contact an ethnic society if you think in this particular community, for example, there were a lot of Danes. Maybe this family was Danish. You could contact them and see if some of your ancestors and their descendants were members of this society. There were also ethnic newspapers, especially for people who just emigrated. Many people were literate and could read and write in their first languages. On this slide is this newspaper. It's titled Vinland, and it is from Minnesota, Minnesota in 1902. And this is a newspaper from a group of Icelandic settlers in that area. Immigrant banks were another entity that created documents that you might be able to search. These ethnic societies, especially the people who came earlier, know how hard it is to establish a home in a new country. So they would create a bank where they wouldn't receive discrimination because of their ethnic status. And as the people were in the United States longer and were able to make money and deposit money, then they were able to provide loans for people who were just coming to the United States. Another interesting way to find a country of origin is through information want ads for lost family members. On your slide here is an inquiry for William and Patrick Daly, and they came from Castle Lloyd, from County Tipperary in Ireland. And this particular want ad or inquiry for missing people was one of columns and columns, and there had to be 100 or more of these in the single issue of the San Francisco Examiner, all of people looking for family members who may have gone west. One thing I want to note to you on this ad is it says, Manitoba papers, please copy. So this ad states the brothers should have gone to Manitoba, Canada, and this ad was most likely placed in a Manitoba, Canada newspaper. It was common for a very long time that to put some sort of sentence like Manitoba papers, please copy, and other newspapers would copy these notices if they had space. So these ads could appear in newspapers all over the place, not just where the ad was originally placed. So let's go back to naturalization records now that we've given you an overview of the different types of records, and let's look at naturalization records in more detail, because there's some really great information that you can glean off of those about your ancestors and maybe even some of their descendants. As you can see from the first bullet point, Congress was not consistent about how many years we needed to be a resident before we could apply for citizenship. It varied from 2 to 14 years, and it's about 5 years from April 1802 to the present. To make our life more interesting, there were 5 different courts that could naturalize citizen. It could be a local court, so depending upon where your ancestor lived, that could be a city court or a town court. It could be the county court, the state court, a federal circuit court, or a federal district court. So what does that mean? There's 5 different places we have to look. Now, before you groan too loudly, companies like Ancestry and FamilySearch.org have digitized records, and they have merged them all together. So you just have to look for naturalization records. You don't have to look for a specific court type. Now, to become a naturalized citizen, if a I'm sorry, a child under the age of 21 became a citizen when his or her father became a citizen. And the same thing for a married woman. So really only the father needed to apply to become a citizen, and his children and wife would become citizens at the same time. The catch was married women. Married women could lose, or a U.S. citizen could lose her citizenship if she married a man who was not a U.S. citizen. And then she would only regain her U.S. citizenship if he became a citizen. That was the law from 1790 until 1922. And from 1795 and onward, single women over the age of 21 could become naturalized citizens in their own right. There were different names for these records, just like there were different years that could be allowed before you could apply for citizenship. The earliest names were called report and registry. The later names are a declaration of intention, sometimes called first papers, and then a petition for naturalization and an oath of allegiance, sometimes called second papers or final papers. And an important document that had to be included with the petition for naturalization and oath of allegiance starting in 1906 was a certificate of arrival from the ship. And in later years, the ship could be an airship or an airplane instead of a sailing vessel. So here is an example of some naturalization records and why they're going to help us figure out where our people came from. This is my third great-grandfather, John Lope. And he applied for citizenship on April 5th, 1856. Remember I said you needed to live in the country for a minimum of 2 years before you applied for citizenship? Well, here it says he came to the United States in 1852, so he actually waited 4 years before he applied. So John states he's a native of Germany, and he's about 31 years old on April 5th, 1856. This gives me a birth date. Bearing allegiance to the King of Württemberg. Now, if this sounds unusual to you, that is because before 1871, in the region we now call Germany, there were actually 17 city-states that had people of German descent. So he came from the region called Württemberg, which I can look up on a map and see it's just a tiny sliver of what is now current Germany. It says he emigrated from Havre. This is Le Havre in France, so he left from that port. And it says he arrived in New York June 9th, 1852. This would be a great place and date to look for a passenger list. I have. It's not there. There were no ships that arrived in New York on June 9th, 1852. And then I checked the entire month of June for ships that came from Le Havre, because I thought maybe he made a mistake on the date that he arrived in New York, but I would think he would remember which port he left from. This is a French port and he speaks German, and the German port was Bremen, so I would think he would remember the right location. So I checked the entire month of June 1852 for ships that came from Le Havre. He's not there. So I'm going to have to keep looking. I mentioned earlier about books. I have found the title of a book that says Germans to America and includes this year 1852. I just haven't made it to the library to look there. So that's my next stop to find out when John actually came to the United States. So that was the intention for citizenship, and this is actually the petition for naturalization on the left and the oath of allegiance on the right. This is the full page. Let me zoom in so that you can see some of the great stuff you can find on these pieces of paper. Here is my Danish ancestor, immigrant ancestor. His name is James Jorgensen. It says where he's living right now at the time of filling out this application. He was born on the 26th of January, 1856 in Nykøbing, Denmark. He left Copenhagen on the 4th of October, 1882 and arrived in New York on the 22nd of October, 1882 on the ship Geyser. Here I lucked out. I did find him on this ship, on that date, in that port, but I found only him. The rest of his family came several months later. He says the date that he filled out his declaration of intention, and he says that he is married, and it includes his wife's name and her maiden name. And here it lists his 7 children and where they are living now. This particular petition for naturalization was completed in 1915. So I know the names of his 7 children, and I know where they are living right now. And even though what I told you previously, that the law said you can become a citizen if your children are under the age of 21, all of these children are far over the age of 21, and they are all still listed. Now, here is his oath of allegiance, where he declared to become a citizen. And here you can see the date, the 20th September, 1915. And here is his signature. There is no mark. So I know right now that my second great-grandfather was literate to some degree. He could write his name. Now, we've talked about a whole bunch of different records and what we could learn from the records trying to figure out our ancestors' country of origin. If those records have not helped you narrow it down, here are some things you can try. Try a timeline. Document your immigrant's life as a whole. That means birth date, location, marriage date, location, possible immigration date, what port they might have come in, where they lived, birth dates of their children, all that sort of thing. By creating the timeline, you can see where you have gaps of information, and by creating the timeline, you can check to see if maybe a child's birth record states where the immigrant was born, where their father and mother were born. That is the type of help that you can get from creating a timeline. Another thing you can do is you need to check all the different record types that you can. That includes the records that are not online if you're going to figure this out. Vital records, birth, marriage, and death records. Church records, baptisms, marriages, burials. The neat thing about church records, for one of my immigrant ancestors, I suspected that they might be from Wales, but I didn't have concrete proof until I looked for the baptism records for the children of the family. This particular church, the baptism records were all written in Welsh. And when I searched for more information about this church, I found out the years that the church operated in the Welsh language before they switched over to the English language. So that's another piece of information that helps me know that particular family came from Wales. Newspapers may also mention where people come from. And don't forget the censuses. The later censuses say where people were born. The earlier censuses do not. So remember, later censuses, the child states where he or she was born and also where the parents were born. So don't forget to go an extra generation when you're looking for the country where your family may have come from. You may need to research the extended family for clues. Who do I mean by that? Brothers and sisters of your immigrant ancestor, aunts and uncles, nephews and nieces, the extended family members, By looking for them, you may find your ancestor. And fan club, friends, associates, and neighbors. One of the things I did not show you on the naturalization record was the witnesses that came with my ancestor to his, I don't know if they did ceremonies then, but they came to the courthouse with him to fill out the paperwork to say that yes, this man is indeed who he says he is, and yes, he has been in the country as long as he says he has. By looking at the friends that came with him so that he could become a naturalized citizen and researching those people and their families, you may find out where your immigrant ancestor came from. The reality is that people did not travel in a vacuum. They did not pick up from somewhere and land in the United States of America and just decide to plunk down on this spot because it looked good. They took the risk of coming to the United States because they had heard from previous family members, from neighbors, from people in their town of what things were like in the United States. And when they came to the United States, they tended to settle in communities that spoke the same language and knew the same customs, because that's going to be more familiar as you're settling into a new way of life. So when all else fails, try the friends, associates, and neighbors. You may come up with for sure a country and maybe even a city or a village where your family members came from. So at this point, I would ask if you had any questions, but we are doing this via a video for you to watch. So with the email that you received with the link to this video, there was also a handout. At the bottom of that handout is my email address. If you have any questions, please email me the questions. And what I'm going to do is I will answer your question, but I will also create a list of questions that I receive from everyone, and we'll do an email blast so that you can see what questions were answered, even if you don't, or asked, even if you don't have any questions, and you can also see what the answers were. So thank you for tuning in and watching this presentation, and please let us know at the WCGS what you thought of this as a substitute, since we cannot do live presentations at this point, and we hope to see you soon.